Hello, this is Professor Imler. I'm here to talk about some of the questions that were posted. I'll be kind of bouncing around and briefly commenting on these questions. If you have any further discussion you'd like to have with me directly, please message me. I got variations of this question, quite a bit in the forums, and so this one reads: ethical egoists, they explain philanthropic events such as volunteering as selfish because they make us feel good about ourselves, right? Or we get public recognition, which in turn feels good. However, how would they explain those who give their entire life to others, such as Mother Teresa? How would ethical egoists be able to find a selfish motivation for individuals like her? Excellent question. This might be a something that's hard for ethical egoists or egoists in general to address. So there's a couple of different things that we can talk about here. One, we might say that what Mother Teresa did, she did get some kind of pleasure response from it, whether it be a deep sense of satisfaction, whether it be a particular type of prolonged dopamine response to helping others, or maybe something like Nietzsche might say is they're brainwashed, to use certain phrasing, that they're following what he calls slave mentality, that people have been tricked into thinking this is the good thing and they'll get rewarded later, or they'll get the feeling good, the dopamine response. But essentially they're tricked into doing these things. So one, maybe it's for gain in the next life. That might be a possible thing. Two, it might be that the person is not acting in their own self-interest, but they've been duped into thinking this is what they should be doing, when instead they should maybe be focusing upon doing what's good for them. But a response to this might be, against the egoist. We might grant them. Yeah, maybe I am getting a measure of pleasure from doing this. I get a sense of satisfaction, but also I'm helping people, and so maybe it's not an either or, maybe it's both. And the thing internally, it's nice that I'm getting a dopamine response and I feel good, but also it's better that other people are being helped. And you might say, when I think about things, there are other pleasurable things I could be doing, but I'm selecting to do the thing that helps others, not just something that helps me alone. And we'll just kind of note that. So maybe there's complexity there. I say complexity. Complexity in our moral choices. And maybe that's okay. That there is some of this is about me, but more of it's about other people. So that's one way we could respond to the egoist. We might also say, hey, there are some actions where we don't get any pleasure out of them, but we decide to do them anyway for the good of these other people. And we might look at those types of actions. We might also say that, and this is something that you kind of pull from Buber's I and Thou, or Levinas's idea of face-to-face, is that as I encounter the other person, as I encounter others, experientially, I discover that there's fundamentally a connection between you and me, and you and other people. And if that's the case, if there's this fundamental connection and fundamental unity of humankind, then to help others and help myself is kind of the wrong question. If we're all enmeshed in the same whateverness, to help one thing is to help the whole. So even to help you maybe helps others. To help others is the you-I distinction breaks down in that kind of a mode of thinking. So those are some possible responses. This is how egoists might think about it. This might be how we respond to the egoists. Are there other theories that are less extreme? So nihilism, moral relativism, egoism, all of these things are very kind of like, they go big or they go home. And they all allow for acts such as murder or stealing because one desires to do so. With egoism, there's a question there, right? It would be okay not because one desires, but because it's in one's long-term best interest. Most ethical egoists will say violence against others is usually not okay. Now, maybe you can say that's an ad hoc addition, but they would often say, hey, if I murder someone, that isn't good for me long term. I might go to jail. My psyche might be might be damaged. If you've talked to anyone who's killed another person, unless they're a sociopath, they'll often say, and this applies to people who are in jail for murdering people, police who have had to kill people or feel like they've had to kill people, military members, they'll say it's not easy to kill someone. Not only is it not easy, but it does harm. It's a psychological trauma. And so an ethical egoist would say murder usually, almost always, is not okay because it's harmful to you, either in terms of your life and not going to jail, or the psychological harm. Stealing is a lot different. So are there things that are less extreme and support the view that murder and all these things are wrong, but still allow for some variance? There's tons of approaches. Natural law will probably the one we deal with next. Consequentialism will certainly allow for at least stealing. Oppression will be out the door. Murder, depending on how you think of what murder is, killing sometimes in consequentialism, but not really murder. But we'll talk about that as the class goes on. So yes, there will be other approaches. Let's see. Let's look at some of these other ones. All right, so these two questions, empathy promoting altruistic motivation. Then there's a question of why are some people good at showing empathy and others? And then why are some people unfazed by immoral actions? This is a really good, complicated issue that we want to spend a little bit of time talking about. So one, empathy seems, from our best research, to be something that comes natural to most people. Certainly before they're socialized, before culture gets at them. Babies tend to be pretty altruistic. Not always. They do have this like mind stuff going on. And young kids often seem to be very much, well, this person needs help, we have to help them. With that said, so some of this might be culture, but also at the same time, and we see this over here, that we can build up a person's empathy by means of training. And if you think about it in terms of like exercise, right? We can maybe exercise our moral muscles. That more that we try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, the more empathy we breed, and then the more empathy we breed, the more altruistic we tend to behave, or at least think is right. And it also seems to be the case that if this can be trained into people, maybe it can be trained out of people. And so maybe if you're a person whose family has historically been non-altruistic, has promoted getting as much as you can whenever you can, well, maybe you're going to take that with you. So maybe it's nurture. In terms of nature, From what I understand, the best evolutionary studies show that humans seem to have developed, or at least showcased, empathy and altruism as a survival mechanism of our gene pool. What causes people to be unfazed by immoral actions? We might want to look at the dehumanization article and look at the dehumanization methods that we found there. Let's kind of move this up so we can see it a little bit. Right, so euphemisms and dysphemisms. One that happened, I think, in the news this week, yesterday. I'm filming this on the 21st. Is I believe our president? Maybe I can dig up the headline. Our president said that the opposing party to him wanted to infest the nation with either immigrants or migrants, etc. And right there, I mean, there's dehumanization going on from the president to these people who are actual, like, human people, trying to come here for a variety of means and methods and reasons. But to reduce them down to an infestation, well, what do you do with an infestation? Think about that. Think about how language determines how we think about issues that we have to deal with when it comes to others. So there's a whole host of methods of dehumanization that you all have done a good job beginning to discuss. So maybe it's worth looking closely at those. Because, and this is something that when people do what we would call immoral actions or hold immoral views, they usually don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as the good people, decent people. And one kind of question in this class is what causes otherwise, we're not apologizing for their behaviors, but otherwise good people to do things that tremendously harm others. And that's a question. And if we can answer that question, if we can figure that out, maybe we can start to say, hey, I see this here. Or I can figure out how to counteract, how to humanize people. And then as I engage with people who are dehumanizing others, maybe I can figure out how to, like, I don't know, convert them or to move them forward or to help them mature or something, depending on the type of language you want to use. Okay, what are some examples of ethical egoism that we can find in the news today? We might say that and bear with me on this, the capitalist impulse is analogous to ethical egoism. And so if the capitalist impulse says the thing that matters the most, so the chief value is capital accumulation, getting as much as you can, whether you're a business, whether you're an individual, etc. Your goal is to just accumulate as much as you can. Why? Because that's the goal of the system. And so we might say, okay, when people live out their lives according to that kind of market logic, and it works well within markets, but when it's applied to things that aren't markets, maybe it becomes harmful. So if I'm a person who is the richest person on earth with their wealth at $120 billion, Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, he's pretty rich, right? And yet the people that work for him, and please look this up, a significant portion of them rely upon public assistance to live, whether it be housing or medicine or food, etc. And that might be a case of ethical egoism where Bezos is doing what he can in his own best interest as much as possible, but is not considering others. So that might be a type of ethical egoism that's really a manifestation of market logic. But what's interesting, what is fascinating and interesting, and I wish I could pull this tweet up quickly, but I can't. But look it up. Bezos, I think in the last week or month, he asked publicly on his Twitter account, hey, what can I do to give back? And so some people said, hey, pay more taxes so we can fund public goods. Other people said, hey, pay your people more. That would be a pretty important way to give back. So anyway, so we might also say, hey, when I look at Bezos, he's at least trying to figure out how to help others. Maybe he's not doing it well. Those are all kinds of political, moral discussions that are good, but we're not going to get into it. Okay. Yeah, what kind of society would we have if there was no altruism and people only help themselves? Well, it depends on who you are. Some of the people we've been looking at, Ayn Rand, she would say we'd have the strongest society that we could possibly have. If everyone was looking out for their own well-being, people would get stronger, smarter, better, more rational, and the weak would die out, would go away, or they could choose to get better. And she says that people can always change, and if they get better, good on them. If not, well, it's better for society if they weren't around. And then that's kind of a ... That stuff doesn't get filled in too much. Other people look at that and go, wow, that is pretty bleak. It seems like a purely selfish society where everyone is only looking out for their long-term best interests. That would be a pretty brutal society that we would not want to live in. And so in connection with that question, we have another one. How can actions be morally right if they promote one's best interest? And we'll kind of erase some of this stuff so we can look at it. Especially those actions that society says is morally wrong, such as murder and theft. So murder, that's pretty hard. So we'll just kind of, I don't know, that might not be possible. So let's scratch that out as I don't know how to justify murder. So we might say that maybe society is structured in such a way that it is unjust. And so let's look at this, and maybe you can think about Bezos, have this in mind. So we might be able to say, okay, maybe we have as premise one, people are entitled to having their basic needs met. We might go further and say not only do they have the right as beings that are valuable, not only to have their basic needs met, but maybe also the ability to flourish. We also might say that in a society, some people are hoarding resources such that people cannot have their needs met. So we might look at Bezos, $120 billion, a good portion of his workers relying upon the government to subsist, not to live well, but to subsist, to eat, to have housing, to have shitty medical care. So if we say that one is happening and two is happening, maybe we might say that having basic needs is more important than hoarding of resources. And so if this is the case, if this is true, then maybe we have an argument that people are entitled to steal, or we might say redistribute, who knows, resources from the hoarders so that people can have their basic needs met. And so that might be an argument where the wider society sees it as theft, but according to this, it is good theft. I don't know. So maybe there's there's something there. Now, if you're just stealing just to improve your lot and you already have your basic needs met, well, that's a different argument. Notice the specifics of this one. So, okay, so those are some of the questions that we got. Keep on discussing this stuff in the forums. You're doing a great job, and I'll talk to you next time.